The teacher called the boy a liar when he said his father worked for NASA. What happened at the parent-teacher conference shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you are from. The moving truck pulled away from the curb with a low, grumbling sigh, leaving behind nothing but a few scuffed tire tracks in the pale concrete and a family of 3 standing under the flat, colorless sky. The house behind them, freshly painted in a bland, market-friendly beige, looked like every other on the block. Small lawn, trimmed bushes, narrow driveway, and a mailbox too clean to feel like it belonged to anyone yet. In this suburban cul-de-sac of Maple Ridge, Ohio, nothing seemed out of place, and maybe that was the point. Everything fit into its mold. Every lawn was cut, every flag hung neatly, and every neighbor waved politely from a distance. 10-year-old Jaden Collins stood with his hands deep in his hoodie pockets, scanning the unfamiliar rows of homes like he was looking for something that might anchor him. He wasn't nervous, not exactly. He'd moved before. His dad's job had taken them from Atlanta to Houston, and now here. But this time felt heavier. Maybe it was because he was older now. Maybe because he already missed the view of the Johnson Space Center from his bedroom window. Or maybe it was just that silence that wrapped around this place like fog. Quiet streets, empty sidewalks, and no one like him in sight. "Come on, bud," his dad said, slapping the trunk of the car with a dull thud. "Let's see what Ohio's got for us." Jaden followed his parents inside, taking a final glance at the street. A woman across the road was watering her petunias, her sunglasses too big for her thin face. She paused when she saw them. Just a second, maybe 2, but enough to feel it. Inside, boxes were already stacked like small towers across the hardwood floor. The air smelled like new paint and lemon-scented cleaning spray, but Jaden barely noticed. His mother was moving with practiced efficiency, calling out where everything should go. His father, still in jeans and a NASA hoodie from last year's Artemis Press event, was trying to hook up the internet. Jaden climbed the stairs, found the room with the best view of the sky, and claimed it silently. Through the window, he could just see the top of an old oak tree and the pale, empty sky beyond it. He imagined constellations out there, just beyond what the daylight concealed. The first day at school came too soon. At Willow Creek Elementary, Jaden was the new kid again. He'd grown used to introductions, but he never enjoyed them. The principal met him with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're so excited to have you, Jaden," she said, then added, "We value diversity," in a tone that made it sound like a policy more than a welcome. His homeroom teacher, Mrs. Blake, was a thin woman with silver-streaked hair tied into a bun and glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She greeted him with a professional courtesy, but with the kind of distance Jaden had come to recognize. Polite, restrained, and disinterested. "This is Jaden Collins. He just moved here from Houston," she said to the class without much fanfare. A few curious faces looked up. Most didn't. Jaden gave a small wave, unsure where to look. "He'll be joining us for the rest of the year. Jaden, why don't you take that empty seat next to Colin?" Colin, a broad-shouldered boy in a football jersey, scooted his chair a few inches away without saying a word. As the morning passed, Jaden tried to focus on the lessons, but he could feel the eyes on him. When he raised his hand to answer a question about the solar system, Mrs. Blake blinked at him, surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to know the answer. "That's correct," she said slowly and moved on without acknowledgement. By lunch, the cafeteria was buzzing with the easy chatter of long-formed cliques. Jaden walked the perimeter like a satellite looking for orbit. Most tables were full. At one, a group of boys stared at him as he passed. "Where you from?" one of them asked. "Houston. You like football?" "Not really," Jaden answered. Another boy snorted. "Figures." He ate lunch alone, staring at the floor tiles. Back at home, his mom asked how it went. He gave her a shrug, said, "Fine," and retreated to his room. There, among the half-unpacked boxes, lay a carefully packed folder labeled Career Day Dad. He opened it slowly. Inside were printed photos of his father in astronaut training gear, standing beside a mock capsule, floating inside the zero-gravity aircraft and holding his NASA ID next to a beaming Jaden. His dad wasn't a full astronaut yet. Not the kind who'd already flown, but he was in the advanced training program selected for the Artemis crew pool. It was real. It was happening. And it was everything to Jaden. That night, as the sky turned to dark navy outside his window, Jaden watched for stars. He couldn't see many, too much light pollution, but he knew they were there. He pulled out one of his notebooks and began sketching the Orion spacecraft. He labeled every part just like his dad had shown him. He'd memorized the flight path of Artemis II and even knew the rotational mechanics for a lunar flyby. In Houston, that had impressed his teachers. Here, he wasn't sure anyone would care. The next week, Willow Creek Elementary announced Career Week. Students would present short talks about their parents' jobs. Mrs. Blake handed out the flyers with little enthusiasm, saying only, "Please prepare something appropriate. No fantasy, no jokes, and let's all be respectful of each other's time." Jaden's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. He stayed up late that night preparing his presentation. He picked the clearest photos, added a chart showing NASA facilities around the country, and practiced saying Artemis without stumbling. "This is great, buddy," his dad said, reviewing the printout. "You really want to include this propulsion schematic?" Jaden nodded. "They'll want to see how it works." His dad smiled. "That's my boy." The night before Career Day, Jaden laid out his NASA shirt, the one from the Artemis Media Day. He brushed it carefully, even though his mom would iron it anyway. He fell asleep dreaming of standing in front of the class, telling them everything. About lunar gravity, about mission windows, about how his dad would walk where so few had walked before. He imagined their faces lighting up in awe. He didn't know yet that sometimes truth alone isn't enough. The next day would change everything. The morning sun filtered weakly through the half-closed blinds in Jaden's bedroom, casting faint lines across his carpet like shadows of a cage. He awoke before his alarm, heart already drumming with anticipation, stomach fluttering with that tight mix of excitement and nervousness that made it hard to breathe deeply. Career Day. He had circled the date on the calendar with a red marker, then gone over it again the next day with blue, just to make sure it stood out. Today was the day he would tell the truth, the whole amazing truth, about who his father was and what he did. Today he would prove that there was something extraordinary about him, about his family, about the things they dreamed of together under the stars. He dressed carefully, pulling on his freshly ironed navy blue NASA shirt, the one with the Artemis mission patch stitched on the chest. It was slightly too big for him, but he liked how it felt, like he was growing into something bigger, something destined. He made sure the edges of the collar were neat, checked the sleeves for any lint, and smoothed his hair twice before going downstairs. His father was already at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reviewing an email on his tablet, dressed in his usual off-duty clothes, jeans, sneakers, and an old t-shirt from his time at the Johnson Space Center. When Jaden entered, He looked up and gave a slow whistle. "Now, that's a look," he said, setting the mug down. "You ready, Cadet Collins?" Jaden gave a small smile, trying to suppress the blush that crept up his neck. "More than ready." His mother packed his folder carefully into his backpack, the one with the solar system print he used only on special occasions. She kissed the top of his head and said, "You've got this, baby. Just be you." At school, the hallways buzzed with chatter and excitement. Posters had been taped along the walls with crayon illustrations of parents in uniforms, at desks, behind steering wheels, with stethoscopes and briefcases. Jaden walked past them all, clutching his backpack a little tighter. A few students glanced at him and then looked away. Some still didn't remember his name. Others did, but only as the new kid. In class, Mrs. Blake stood by the whiteboard with her clipboard in hand, her lips pursed in their usual thin line. She called for order, clapping her hands once. "Today, we'll be hearing from a few of you about your parents' professions," she said. "Remember, be concise, be respectful, and above all, be honest. No exaggerations or jokes. Let's be mature about this." Jaden felt a twinge in his chest. The way she said it, like a warning, lingered too long in the air. He pushed it away. She didn't mean anything by it, probably said that every year. He sat straighter in his chair and glanced at the folder tucked under his desk. One by one, students stood and shared their stories. Emma's dad was a dentist. Trevor's mom worked in real estate. Colin, the boy who'd moved his chair away from Jaden on the first day, stood proudly and said his father coached high school football. Each presentation earned polite claps and approving nods from Mrs. Blake. Then Jaden's name was called. He stood slowly, heart pounding, mouth dry. He carried the folder up to the front of the room and opened it on the stand Mrs. Blake had set up for the students. The first photo he held up showed his father in a flight suit, smiling beside a training module. "My name is Jaden Collins," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "My dad is an astronaut in the NASA Artemis program." The room went quiet. Some students leaned forward, a few exchanged looks. A boy in the back gave a small laugh that was quickly smothered. "He's in training right now for a future lunar mission," Jaden continued, flipping to the next photo, a shot of his dad floating inside the zero-gravity plane, arms spread wide like wings. "He was selected last year and works with a team that includes engineers, scientists, and other astronauts. He's training for extended spaceflight and surface operations." A few hands shot up, but Mrs. Blake didn't call on anyone. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, arms crossed over her cardigan. Her expression was hard to read, neutral, but with something clipped beneath it. "Jaden," she said, her voice smooth, almost pleasant, but tinged with something that sent a shiver up his spine. "We did say to keep things realistic today." He blinked. "It is realistic. It's true." "I'm sure your father has a very interesting job," she said, her tone tightening. "But there's no need to embellish. Astronauts live in places like Houston or Florida. We're in Ohio. Maybe next time you can tell us what he really does." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. For a second, he didn't even know what to say. Around him, students were shifting in their seats. Someone giggled. Another whispered, "Liar." A third mimed a rocket blasting off behind his back. "But," Jaden began. Mrs. Blake raised her hand, cutting him off. "Thank you, Jaden. That's enough. You can sit down now." He stood there, folder still open, the picture of his dad half raised in his hand. His vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment he thought he might cry, but he didn't. He closed the folder, walked back to his desk, and sat down, carefully, slowly, like he was afraid the chair might disappear beneath him. The rest of the class went on. More kids presented. More polite claps. Jaden heard none of it. His ears buzzed with a low, angry static. He stared down at his desk, face hot, hands trembling inside his lap. When the final bell rang, he didn't move. Not at first. He waited until the class was nearly empty before stuffing the folder into his backpack and walking to the bus alone. No one spoke to him. Not a single word. That night at dinner, he said little. His mother noticed first. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked, placing a bowl of green beans on the table. Jaden shrugged. "Yeah." His father looked up from his plate. "How'd career day go?" "It was fine," Jaden mumbled. His parents exchanged glances. His mother tried again. "Did they like your presentation?" "I guess." There was a pause. Then his father gently asked, "Did something happen?" Jaden stabbed at his food with his fork. "She said I was lying." Silence. "Who did?" His mother said slowly. "My teacher, Mrs. Blake. She said astronauts don't live in Ohio. Said I made it up." His father's eyes darkened. "In front of the class." Jaden nodded. "She said I should be honest, that I was making up stories for attention. Everyone laughed." His mother sat back, lips pressed together, fury boiling just beneath her calm exterior. His father's jaw was tight, his hands clenched on the table. Jaden looked up then, eyes shining with unshed tears. "She didn't even ask. She just said it like it wasn't even possible." His father let out a slow breath. "It is possible," he said quietly. "And you were telling the truth? You did everything right." Jaden looked down. "Did I?" That night, long after Jaden had gone to bed, his parents sat in the living room, the glow of the television flickering unheeded in the background. His mother was pacing. "We have to say something," she said. "This isn't just some mistake. She humiliated him. She erased him." His father nodded slowly. "I'll handle it." "How?" "I'll request a meeting. I'll talk to her face to face." "Do you think she'll even listen?" "She'll have to. And if she doesn't, the district will." He stood, walked to the hallway, and paused outside Jaden's door. Inside, their son was curled on his side, the folder still clutched under one arm. Even in sleep, his brow was furrowed. His father stood there for a long time, staring at the boy he was raising to believe that truth always mattered, that dreams were worth defending. He hadn't known that such dreams could be so casually dismissed in a single moment, in a single sentence spoken by someone with authority. But he knew one thing with certainty. They weren't going to let it end this way. The following days passed like a slow, dull echo, where each hour bled into the next with little distinction. For Jaden, school became a quiet prison. The white hallways, once just bland, now felt sterile and too bright, each fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead like a whispered warning. The air carried tension, some of it imagined, some of it real. He moved through the halls like a ghost, unseen until someone decided to see him, and then it was only to mutter under their breath or giggle after he passed. The laughter had taken on a shape now. It wasn't loud or cruel in the traditional sense. It was subtle, whispered, just loud enough to sting. "NASA boy," someone said once in the lunch line. Another time, as he walked past the playground basketball court, he heard, "There goes the liar. Probably thinks his dad's on the moon." The words trailed him like a fog. They weren't shouted, but they didn't have to be. In the classroom, Mrs. Blake treated him no differently than before, but that was the problem. She didn't meet his eyes, didn't call on him, even when he raised his hand. didn't acknowledge the pause she had created in his life, the one that now stretched out longer and darker with every day. She behaved as if her dismissal had never happened, as if it was a footnote, not a fracture. Jaden stopped raising his hand. He stopped answering questions, even the ones he knew well. When they reviewed the solar system again in science class, something he could have taught better than the textbook, he sat still, quiet, letting the moment pass him by. He folded in on himself. His once carefully organized desk became messy. His handwriting turned smaller. He started finishing his assignments quickly, without effort, just to get them out of the way. At lunch, he chose the far table by the window, the one no one else wanted because the sunlight hit it too directly. He sat with his back to the room, trying to disappear. The folder from Career Day never left his backpack, but he stopped opening it. The corners of the printed photos were starting to curl. The picture of his father in the flight suit had a crease through his smile. At home, he said, even less than before. His parents noticed immediately. He still came down for dinner, still did his homework, but the energy was gone from his movements like someone had unplugged him from within. His mother asked questions softly, then more directly. His answers never changed. "It's fine. I'm tired. I don't want to talk about it." He said these things with a shrug that was almost convincing, but it wasn't convincing to his mother. She watched him one evening as he sat at the kitchen table, pushing his macaroni and cheese in circles on the plate. His father had just gotten off a call with a colleague at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California and was explaining the new testing schedule for thermal shielding. Normally, Jaden would have perked up, asked a dozen questions, maybe gone to fetch one of his mission notebooks to draw out the mechanics. But now he barely looked up. His mother sat down beside him and gently placed a hand on his back. "Baby," she said, "you're not yourself." He hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm fine." She didn't press further that night, but later, in the bedroom she shared with her husband, she let her worry pour out in a hushed, heated voice. "He's shutting down," she said. "You see it, don't you? He's not bouncing back." "I know," his father replied, staring at his laptop, which remained unopened on his lap. "I'm writing the email tonight." She folded her arms. "It should have been written already." "I wanted to wait," he said, then sighed. "I thought maybe it would blow over." Well, it didn't. You saw his face. He doesn't believe in himself right now, and I swear to God if we don't fix this, he's going to carry it with him for years. His father didn't respond right away. He set the laptop aside and rubbed his hands over his face. The man who had stayed calm under pressure in high-altitude test simulations now looked uncertain in the quiet of his own home. "I'll fix it," he said finally. "I promise." He wrote the email the next morning. It was direct, polite, and firm. He introduced himself formally, explained who he was and what had happened during Career Day, and requested a meeting with Mrs. Blake during the upcoming parent-teacher conferences. He didn't accuse or demand, but every word carried weight, like it had been sharpened for clarity. Mrs. Blake's response came that afternoon. It was courteous and brief. "Thank you for reaching out. I would be happy to meet during conferences. I look forward to clearing up any misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. The word clanged in his chest like metal. There was no misunderstanding. She had called his son a liar. She had invalidated his life with a few careless words. When he showed the message to his wife, she read it twice, then muttered, "You're not going alone." He looked up. "I can handle it." "I'm not saying you can't," she said. I'm saying I won't sit at home while someone tries to minimize what she did to our son." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." In the days leading up to the conference, Jaden remained quiet. He still wore his NASA shirt sometimes, but without the same pride. He started sketching cars instead of rockets in the margins of his notebooks. When asked about his father's job by one of the younger kids at the bus stop, he simply said, "He works with science stuff." That Saturday, his father found him in his room, sitting on the floor with his back to the bed, knees drawn up, sketchbook open on his lap. The pages were filled with stars, but they were dark, scribbled in black ink, heavy lines overlaid again and again until they bled through the paper. His father sat beside him, not saying anything for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "I think I messed up." Jaden didn't answer. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have defended you sooner." Jaden stared down at the blackened page. She didn't even ask. She just said it wasn't true. "I know." She said I was making it up to get attention, but I didn't. I just told them the truth. "I know." Jaden looked up, his voice small but brittle. "Why didn't she believe me?" His father exhaled through his nose. "Sometimes people see what they expect to see, and if something doesn't fit their picture of the world, they decide it's easier to say it's not real." "Because I'm a kid?" His father paused. "Because you're a black kid, and because they don't think people like us belong in places like NASA, or on rocket crews, or standing at the front of a classroom talking about space." Jaden's eyes shimmered, and he blinked fast. His father leaned closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But that's their problem, not yours. You didn't lie. You didn't exaggerate. You stood up and told your truth. That takes more courage than most adults have." Jaden nodded, and a tear slipped down his cheek. "We're going to talk to your teacher," his father said, "both of us, and she's going to hear you, because your voice matters." "Will she believe you?" "She'll have no choice." Jaden wiped his eyes and gave a shaky laugh. "Can I wear my Artemis shirt again?" His father smiled. "You better." Later that night, Jaden pulled the career day folder from the bottom of his backpack. The papers were a little wrinkled now, and one of the photos had a bent corner, but it was all still there. He smoothed them carefully on his bed, rearranged the pages in the right order, and slid them back into the plastic sleeves. Before going to sleep, he placed the folder on his desk, where it caught the faint moonlight coming in through the window. The shadows were still there, but they no longer felt suffocating. And, in the stillness of his room, Jaden looked up at the night sky through the glass and whispered to himself, "I told the truth." Tomorrow, the adults would have their turn. The day of the parent-teacher conference arrived under a gray sky, thick with the kind of clouds that promised rain but never quite delivered. The cold hung in the air in that hollow Midwest way, the wind moving through the trees like a whisper of something unfinished. Jaden sat by the living room window that afternoon, watching leaves scrape across the pavement in small, listless spirals. He had asked to stay home instead of going with his parents, and after some hesitation they had agreed. His mother said she'd rather he not be there for what could turn into a very uncomfortable conversation. His father, however, had been ready since early morning. He'd gone through his materials 3 times, his NASA identification badge, printed copies of his official role in the Artemis program, recent photographs from the training center, and a sealed envelope containing a letter of verification from the mission's senior administrator. A precaution, though one he hoped wouldn't be necessary. Each item had been selected not just to validate his position, but to leave no room for plausible denial. He wasn't coming to defend a fantasy. He was coming to present reality. Jaden's mother had dressed sharply, her blouse tucked into a navy skirt, jacket pressed and collar firm. Her earrings were subtle, her makeup understated, but her expression was fierce, lips set in a line, eyes watchful and ready. She had been the one to insist she attend, and her husband hadn't questioned her. There was a fire in her now that he knew better than to stand in front of. They arrived at Willow Creek Elementary 15 minutes early. The parking lot was half full, the glow of overhead lights flickering against a gray evening sky. Inside, the school hallways were decorated with student artwork, portraits of parents drawn in crayon and labeled in crooked handwriting. Jaden's picture was nowhere to be seen. His mother noticed. She didn't say anything, but her eyes narrowed. The light inside was dim, the windows fogged slightly from the press of cold air against warm glass. She stood as they entered, rising from behind her desk with that familiar professional smile, the same one she had worn when she first greeted Jaden weeks ago. It was a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins," she said, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." The chairs were child-sized, too small and too low, which made the conversation feel tilted from the start. Still, Jaden's father sat down calmly, carefully laying the folder on his lap. His wife followed, adjusting her posture with quiet precision. Mrs. Blake folded her hands on the desk, her expression composed. "I understand you had some concerns about Career Day. I'm glad we can clear up any misunderstandings." There it was again. That word. As though what had happened to their son was a miscommunication instead of a public dismissal. Jaden's father leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. "My son came home from school last week confused, upset, and humiliated. He told us that when he presented my job during Career Day, you told him, publicly, that he was lying." Mrs. Blake's smile tightened. "I simply reminded the class that we were focused on real professions and encouraged them to be honest in their presentations. Sometimes children, especially when they're trying to impress new classmates, can exaggerate." His mother inhaled sharply, but held her tongue. Her husband continued. "There was no exaggeration. Jaden was completely honest. I'm an astronaut candidate with NASA, currently in training for the Artemis program. I've worked in aerospace engineering for 15 years and was selected for astronaut candidacy 2 years ago." Mrs. Blake tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "Forgive me, Mr. Collins, but I've been teaching for over 20 years. I've had students claim their parents are superheroes or spies. It's not uncommon for children to embellish." This time his mother spoke. "And do you correct every child publicly in front of their peers, or only the black ones who say something you don't think fits your idea of what's believable?" Mrs. Blake's face flushed. "I certainly didn't mean it that way," she said quickly. "I treat all my students equally." "You treated our son like a liar," Jaden's father said, and his voice was no longer soft. "In front of the entire class. You didn't ask for clarification. You didn't call us. You didn't do a single Google search. You simply decided on the spot that a 10-year-old black boy talking about NASA must be making it up." Mrs. Blake opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced at the folder on his lap, then at his wife's narrowed gaze, and seemed to realize for the first time that this was not a conversation she could control with practiced smiles. Jaden's father opened the folder. He laid out the badge first, official, laminated, with the blue NASA insignia prominent in the corner. Then a photograph, him in a training suit, standing next to the Orion capsule. Then a printed page listing his official assignment within the Artemis program, with contact information for verification. Mrs. Blake picked up the badge and stared at it, as if seeing something foreign. "Pasadena?" she asked. "Jet Propulsion Laboratory," he said. "NASA is not just Florida and Texas. We have facilities across the country." She blinked. I wasn't aware." "No," said his wife, "you weren't. But instead of checking, you decided our son was pretending. You made a spectacle of him. You fed the class a narrative that he was attention-seeking, and the other kids followed your lead." "I wouldn't say I humiliated him," Mrs. Blake muttered. "You called him a liar," Jaden's father said. "At 10 years old, in front of the people he's trying to fit in with. How else would you describe it?" There was silence in the room, the kind that only comes when there's nowhere left to retreat. The weight of it pressed into the corners, curling around the desk and the cheap chairs and the curled edges of the student artwork taped to the walls. Mrs. Blake shifted in her seat. "You're right," she said finally, quietly. "I should have handled it differently. I should have asked. I should have checked." "But you didn't," said his mother. "No," Mrs. Blake admitted. "I didn't." She looked down at the photo on the desk, Jaden's father, mid-laugh, floating in the parabolic arc of a training flight. "I'm sorry," she said, "to both of you. I made an assumption, and it was wrong." His father didn't nod. "You owe that apology to Jaden, not just privately, but in front of the class, the same way you dismissed him." Mrs. Blake swallowed hard. "Of course. I'll speak with him tomorrow." "A private apology won't undo the public harm," his mother said. "You embarrassed him in public. You need to correct that the same way." There was another pause. Then, slowly, Mrs. Blake nodded. "I understand." They discussed how the apology would be handled, not as a lecture, but as a teachable moment. A chance to talk to the students about NASA's many branches, about careers in space science, and about the danger of making assumptions based on incomplete information. Mrs. Blake was hesitant at first, but the quiet determination in Jaden's parents gave her no room for polite deflection. As the meeting ended and they stood to leave, Jaden's father paused. "There's something else," he said. "I'd like to come in and give a proper presentation. Not just to fix what was broken, but because there are kids in that classroom who may never get to meet someone like me. I want them to know the stars are for them too." For the first time that evening, Mrs. Blake's smile seemed genuine. "That would be wonderful. I think they'd really enjoy that." Jaden's parents walked out into the cold evening, saying little at first. The wind had picked up. The trees had lost most of their leaves. In the car, his mother buckled in and stared straight ahead for a moment before saying, "She didn't know how to handle being wrong." "No," her husband replied, "but now she has to." Back at home, Jaden sat at the dining table with a half-completed math worksheet in front of him. When he heard the front door open, he stood, heart quickening. His father walked in, nodded once, and held up the folder. "You were right to be proud," he said. Jaden smiled, small, cautious, but real. The shadows were still there, but the silence had been broken. And in the breaking of that silence something had shifted. Not everything was fixed, but something had begun. The morning that followed the parent-teacher conference arrived with a surprising stillness. It wasn't just the weather, though the air had softened overnight, the wind finally at rest, but something quieter, something within the walls of the Collins home. There was no sound of hurried footsteps upstairs, no last-minute scramble to find a missing homework sheet or untangle the headphone cord before the bus arrived. Instead, Jaden sat at the kitchen table with a calmness his parents hadn't seen in weeks, sipping from a glass of orange juice while quietly reading over a science article on his tablet. He didn't say much, but the silence around him wasn't heavy or distant anymore. It was focused, steady. He was still afraid, still unsure of what the day might bring, but there was something different in the way he moved, like someone stepping cautiously back into sunlight after too long in the shade. His father had promised that things would change. Today would be the start. Jaden had almost asked if he could stay home again, almost said he wasn't ready to face the class after everything, but something in his father's voice the night before, calm but certain, had made him hold back. His mother had offered to walk him to the bus stop, but he had shaken his head. When he stepped outside that morning, the air was brisk and the sun hadn't fully broken through the clouds, but he didn't pull his hood up or look at the ground as he waited. He stood tall, backpack slung over both shoulders, the corners of his NASA folder pressing lightly against his spine. He didn't look at the kids gathered at the stop. He didn't need to. When he walked into class that morning, Mrs. Blake was already there, standing by the whiteboard erasing yesterday's lesson. Her movements were slower than usual, more deliberate, and when she turned and saw him enter, she gave a small nod, not the kind she usually gave students to acknowledge their presence, but something more careful, more intentional. Jaden took his seat without a word. He kept his eyes forward, his face neutral. The room slowly filled. Emma took her seat to his right without a glance. Colin sat down on his left and muttered something to the boy next to him, too low for Jaden to catch. He didn't bother asking. The tension in the room was different today, muted but expectant. Some of the students had noticed the energy in their teacher shift the day before, when she returned from the conference quieter than usual, her voice softer during dismissal. Today, her tone carried the same cautious care as she greeted the class and asked them to settle down. "Before we start our regular lessons," Mrs. Blake said, placing the dry erase marker back in its tray, "I want to take a moment to talk about something important." She glanced briefly at Jaden, then addressed the room. "Last week, during our Career Day presentations, there was an incident in which I made a mistake, an assumption, about one of our classmates. Jaden shared information about his father's work with NASA, and I responded in a way that was dismissive and unfair." A hush fell over the room, heavier than the usual classroom silence. The kind of hush that meant something real was happening. "I want you all to understand," she continued, her voice steady but stripped of the authority it usually held, "that I misjudged what Jaden told us, and in doing so, I disrespected him. I should have asked questions instead of assuming I knew the truth. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." She turned to face Jaden directly. "I'm sorry, Jaden. You deserved better." Jaden met her eyes. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then, quietly but clearly, he replied, "Thank you." Mrs. Blake turned back to the class. "There's a lesson here for all of us," she said. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen before we judge, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, to be curious instead of certain. That's how scientists work. That's how we grow as people." And to help us learn more about that, we have a very special guest joining us this Friday. There was a ripple of interest through the classroom. Someone whispered, "Is it someone famous?" Another said, "Is it Jaden's dad?" Mrs. Blake smiled faintly. "Jaden's father has graciously agreed to speak with us about his work at NASA. He'll be bringing some materials and giving a presentation about space exploration and the Artemis missions. I hope you'll all be ready with thoughtful questions." Jaden sat still. His heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with a strange warming pulse of relief and anticipation. There was still unease around him, still the memory of laughter and disbelief, but now something new was rising above it. A chance to speak again, a chance to be heard. That afternoon, during lunch, he was sitting at his usual table when someone approached. It was a boy from across the room, a quiet one, Matthew, who rarely spoke. He had messy hair and always smelled faintly of peanut butter. "Hey," Matthew said, stopping beside him. "Is it true your dad's been in zero gravity?" Jaden looked up cautious. "Yeah, in the training jet. They call it the vomit comet." Matthew grinned. "That's gross, but cool." He sat down without asking. A minute later, 2 other boys joined, whispering questions and leaning across the table. Jaden didn't answer all of them, but he didn't look away either. Over the next few days, the tone of the classroom began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic change, no sudden applause or tearful confessions, but something quieter, deeper. The whispers faded, the glances softened. Emma passed him a glue stick during an art project without hesitation. Colin, while still distant, no longer shifted his chair away from Jaden's desk. The others, those who had laughed or scoffed, now waited, watched, unsure of how to act, but sensing that the lines had been redrawn. Jaden's voice returned slowly in increments. He answered a science question on Thursday with quiet confidence, earning a nod from Mrs. Blake. He volunteered to write the date on the board. He corrected someone's confusion about the order of the planets, and no one laughed. That Friday, he arrived at school earlier than usual. His father was already there, unloading materials from the trunk of the car. They carried them together: models, posters, a display monitor, a small case of artifacts cleared by NASA for educational purposes. As they entered the building, Mrs. Blake met them at the door, her demeanor respectful, her tone lighter. Jaden helped set up the classroom, laying out handouts on each desk, arranging the posters in a neat line along the chalkboard. When the students arrived, their eyes lit up. Whispers filled the room again, but they were different now, buzzing with anticipation, not mockery. Mrs. Blake introduced the speaker, stepping aside without fanfare. Jaden's father took the front of the room with ease, commanding attention not with volume, but with presence. He began with a simple story: how he had grown up watching shuttle launches on an old TV, dreaming of the stars just like any kid. How he'd studied engineering, faced doubters, passed through doors that weren't always open for people who looked like him. Then he showed the photos. The kids gasped. He brought out the patch from his flight suit. He played a short video of his zero-gravity flight. Hands shot into the air. Questions flew fast and eager. How do you eat in space? Do you sleep standing up? What happens if you sneeze in your helmet? Jaden watched from the front row, his smile spreading wider with every question. He wasn't just watching his father teach. He was watching something bigger unfold, an idea take shape in the minds of his classmates, a boundary dissolve. He was watching them believe. At the end, Mrs. Blake thanked Mr. Collins with sincerity. "This has been one of the most engaging sessions we've ever had," she said. "I think you've given our students a lot to think about." His father turned to the class. "There's room for all of you in the future," he said. "The stars don't care where you're from. They just wait." The bell rang. The students filed out, chattering excitedly. Jaden stayed behind to help pack up. When they were done, Mrs. Blake approached again. "Jaden," she said, "I'm glad you spoke up, and I'm glad you kept believing." Jaden looked at her, then nodded. "Thank you." As they walked back to the car, his father nudged him gently. "You did good, cadet." Jaden didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, still pale with early morning light, but vast and endless above the horizon. He felt like his voice had traveled there and back, and it had returned stronger. The Monday after the presentation was the first time Jaden walked into class with a faint, steady feeling of anticipation rather than dread. His body still remembered the weight of the earlier weeks, the tightness in his chest, the ache behind his eyes that came from holding back tears too many times. But now there was a new rhythm underneath it all. His legs didn't drag as he stepped through the school doors. His shoulders no longer hunched as he passed the front office or walked down the hallway. Something had lifted. Not everything, not fully, but enough to let light through. Even the classroom seemed different. The same rows of desks, the same pale blue posters with motivational phrases curling slightly at the corners, the same smell of dry erase markers and hand sanitizer. But the air had shifted. There was a hum now, quiet and tentative, like a place learning to breathe again. Students looked up when he walked in. Some smiled. Emma offered a small wave from her seat near the window. Matthew nodded, already unzipping his backpack. Jaden gave them each a quiet return glance, then took his seat. Mrs. Blake began the day with a science warm-up, projecting a list of space-related questions onto the board. It wasn't part of the scheduled curriculum. Jaden knew this because he had the syllabus memorized like a launch sequence. But she didn't say anything about it. She simply turned to the class and said, "Let's see what we remember from Friday." Jaden blinked. The questions were thoughtful, not just facts, but open-ended. What surprised you the most about the Artemis mission? How does seeing someone like Mr. Collins in that role change your view of space exploration? What questions do you still have? He looked around. The students were writing, not reluctantly, not under protest, but with something close to enthusiasm. Several leaned over their desks, brows furrowed in concentration. Jaden's pencil moved across his paper before he realized he had already started. After the warm-up, Mrs. Blake transitioned into a new unit, one the class hadn't expected. She announced it with an ease that didn't quite hide the effort behind it. "For the next 3 weeks," she said, "we'll be working on a space-themed research project. Each of you will choose a topic related to space. Past missions, future goals, the technology we use, the people involved, and create a presentation. At the end, we'll host a space discovery day for the other classes to visit." A murmur spread through the room. Matthew raised his hand. "Can we do stuff like how the Mars rover works?" "Yes," Mrs. Blake said. "That's a great example." Emma raised her hand next. "Can we work in pairs?" "If you choose. Just make sure both partners are contributing." Colin, who had said little since the day of the apology, raised his hand last. "Can we do our projects about astronauts, like real ones?" Mrs. Blake nodded. "Absolutely." She handed out a list of topic ideas, each one carefully curated. Jaden scanned it quickly. His father's name wasn't on the list. Mrs. Blake hadn't tried to insert him for extra points, but the Artemis program was. He felt a strange sense of balance in that. Not forced recognition, just inclusion. Space for his story, among others. As the class broke into groups to discuss ideas, something else happened that Jaden didn't expect. Colin stood, walked over to Jaden's desk, and hovered awkwardly for a moment. "Hey," he said. Jaden looked up. Do you want to be partners? The question hit harder than it should have. For weeks, Colin had been the loudest in the room without needing to say much at all. His glances, his laughter, his sideways comments had drawn the lines of who was in and who wasn't. And now he was asking to stand beside him. Jaden hesitated. He could still feel the old sting, the echo of that moment during career day when he'd stood at the front of the room, folder in hand, while the laughter danced behind him. But things were different now. Okay, he said. They started planning that afternoon, sitting side by side at the long table in the back of the room. Jaden offered the idea of focusing on the Artemis I mission, the first of the series that would eventually lead to humans returning to the moon. Colin agreed, his usual bluster subdued. My uncle's a mechanic, Colin said while sketching out the first slide. He works with engines, but not like rocket engines. That stuff's wild. Jaden smiled. The propulsion systems are based on Newton's laws. The hard part is controlling direction in space. Colin looked at him. You're like really smart about this stuff. Jaden shrugged. It's just what I like. By the end of the week, the project boards were beginning to take shape. The classroom was alive with movement. Kids cutting out photos, scribbling notes, testing animations on their slides. Jaden moved from his desk to the resource shelf with ease now, no longer feeling like each step might crack the floor beneath him. Mrs. Blake walked by their table one afternoon, paused, and studied their board. This is coming together nicely, she said, her voice calm. Colin looked up, surprised by the compliment. Jaden nodded. We're adding a diagram of the SLS rocket tomorrow. She smiled, then turned back to her desk. The night before the school's Space Discovery Day, Jaden sat at the dining table with his father, going over final details. His mother was in the kitchen, preparing a tray of cupcakes decorated like planets. Her idea, not his, but he didn't mind. You proud of what you made? His father asked, flipping through the slideshow. Yeah, Jaden said. I think we did good. You sure about partnering with that Colin kid? Jaden paused. He's okay. He didn't have to ask, but he did. His father considered that. People surprise you sometimes. Jaden smiled. You said that before. About stars, too. Because it's true. The next day, the classroom was transformed. Desks had been pushed to the walls, leaving open space for the display boards and laptops. Posters hung from the ceiling. The models were placed on counters, including one of the Artemis capsule Jaden had printed from a NASA template at home. Students from other classes walked through in small groups, asking questions, filling out worksheets. Jaden stood beside Colin as they explained their project over and over, refining their words each time, learning when to pause and when to elaborate. At one point, a first grader pointed to a photo of the launch pad. Is that where your dad works? Jaden nodded. He trains in Houston and travels to Florida for simulations. That's one of the places. The child's eyes went wide. That's so cool, Colin added. He came to our class, showed us videos, real ones. The boy nodded solemnly and walked away. Near the end of the day, Mrs. Blake stood in the doorway, watching the room with a quiet expression. Jaden saw her pause when she looked at him and Colin, their heads bent over a tablet, explaining the ignition sequence. Her face didn't show anything dramatic. No guilt, no beaming pride, but her eyes held something else. Recognition, understanding, acknowledgement. That was enough. When the event ended and the room was back in order, Mrs. Blake approached Jaden with a stack of printed worksheets for the next unit. "I'll be introducing planetary physics next month," she said. "Would you mind looking over the lesson plan before then, just to make sure it's accurate?" Jaden blinked. "You want me to check it?" She nodded. "If you're willing." He nodded. "Okay." When he walked out of the school that afternoon, backpack heavier than usual, he didn't mind. The sky overhead was still Ohio gray, but in his mind, the stars were clear. Not just out there, far away, unreachable, but something close, something possible. And this time, he knew others saw them too. It started with a single line on the school announcements. A brief message read over the intercom just before the bell rang to signal the end of homeroom. Students interested in astronomy or space science are invited to attend a meeting next Wednesday during lunch to learn about a new after-school opportunity. No other details were offered. No names, no explanations. The words floated through the morning like dust motes in sunlight, barely noticed by most students, passed over in favor of chatter about video games, weekend plans, or cafeteria menu changes. But for Jaden, the sentence echoed. He'd been sitting in his usual seat near the window, half focused on the review activity Mrs. Blake had assigned when the announcement played. His pencil had paused mid-equation. It was a quiet moment, almost unremarkable, but something stirred under his skin like a gentle current. He knew, without needing to ask, that this wasn't just any club. At lunch, while most kids scattered toward their usual corners, Jaden approached Mrs. Blake's desk. She was wiping down a stack of math manipulatives, distracted but alert as always. When she saw him, she straightened. "You heard the announcement?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded. "I've spoken with the principal," she continued. "We're starting a space science club. It'll be small at first, exploratory. Weekly meetings after school. I thought it might be a good way to keep the momentum going after the Discovery Day presentations." Jaden hesitated. "Did you come up with the idea?" She looked at him, then smiled. "Let's just say I was inspired." He didn't press further. Something about her expression, the way it softened when she said that, told him the idea had taken root after everything that had happened, and maybe it was her way of building something from what had once felt like wreckage. The following Wednesday, Jaden sat alone in the science room during lunch, waiting to see who else might come. For 5 minutes, the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights and the distant clang of trays in the cafeteria. He fiddled with the edge of a folder he'd brought, the one with extra Artemis pamphlets and a couple of NASA sticker sheets his dad had mailed from a training event in California. He didn't expect a crowd. He wasn't even sure if anyone else had really paid attention to the announcement. Then Matthew walked in, clutching a half-eaten granola bar and a juice box. "Is this it?" he asked, peering around the empty room. Jaden shrugged. "I guess so. For now." Matthew sat down without further comment and started flipping through one of the space posters Jaden had brought. A few minutes later, Emma appeared, followed by a sixth grader Jaden didn't know by name. The door creaked once more before Colin slid in, trying to act casual, his tray balanced on one hand, eyes darting around like he'd just made a bet with himself and didn't want to admit he cared about the outcome. Mrs. Blake entered last, holding a plastic bin filled with books, handouts, and a small tabletop telescope. She looked at the students, counted them quickly, and gave a short, satisfied nod. "I think we've got a crew," she said. "Let's get started." The first few meetings were small, quiet, and awkward in the way most new groups are. Mrs. Blake started with simple topics: what each student knew about space, what they wanted to learn, what kind of projects or experiments they might enjoy. Jaden mostly listened at first, offering suggestions only when pressed. He didn't want to dominate the group. He knew he could if he wanted. He had more knowledge than most of the others combined. But he'd learned enough over the past few weeks to understand that sometimes leadership meant stepping back. Colin surprised him by suggesting a hands-on activity, a scale model of the solar system using chalk on the basketball court. Like, make the sun a beach ball, then figure out where Neptune ends up, he said. We'll probably run out of schoolyard. Matthew chimed in. Can we use the gym if it rains? Mrs. Blake smiled. We'll see what we can get approved. As the weeks passed, the group began to grow. Word spread, not fast, but steadily. A few curious students from other grades stopped by to peek through the door. Some stayed. Others returned the following week. One of the fifth-grade teachers sent her nephew, who was obsessed with black holes. A fourth grader showed up one day with a shoebox full of homemade constellation cards. Soon, the room began to feel less like a classroom and more like a mission hub. Mrs. Blake, to her credit, let the club evolve naturally. She guided without micromanaging, giving the students freedom to suggest topics and lead discussions. She occasionally brought in guest speakers from nearby colleges or STEM outreach programs, but most of the learning came from the students themselves. Jaden found himself mentoring others, answering questions, drawing diagrams on the board. He never bragged, never made anyone feel small. He just explained, and people listened. One afternoon, Mrs. Blake pulled him aside after the meeting. I was thinking, she said, we might apply for a small grant through the district, enough to get a proper telescope, maybe a few kits. Jaden blinked. You can do that? We can, she said, if you help me write the proposal. He nodded slowly. Okay. They spent the next week putting it together, Mrs. Blake handling the logistics, Jaden contributing the vision. He wrote a section about why space exploration matters, quoting from his father's notes and adding his own thoughts about inspiration, imagination, and the importance of visibility. When they submitted it, they both felt something quiet but hopeful settle between them. Outside of the club, life continued. Jaden still got the occasional look in the hallway, the occasional comment. Not all wounds heal at the same speed, and not every student forgot who laughed or who stayed silent. But the sharpness had dulled. The atmosphere of suspicion had faded, replaced by a cautious normalcy. It was enough. At home, his parents noticed the change in him. He talked more again, not just about school, but about the future. He asked his dad to tell him stories from training, to explain again the difference between LEO and GTO to watch the old Apollo footage together. He started a new notebook, labeled boldly on the front, Jaden 1, Mission Planning Journal. His mother peeked inside one day and found pages filled with timelines, rocket designs, handwritten checklists. She closed it gently and left it on his desk without saying a word, but her smile lingered all evening. One evening, the school sent out a newsletter. In it was a short article about the Space Club, its formation, its purpose, a photo of the students gathered around a cardboard model of the moon's surface. Jaden stood near the center, his hand pointing toward a rover mock-up, his face lit by the overhead lights. The caption read, Exploring New Worlds, Willow Creek's Space Club launches with big dreams. When the newsletter reached the district office, it caught more attention than expected. A regional STEM coordinator contacted the school, offering to donate resources and connect the club with a local university's outreach department. Mrs. Blake called Jaden to her desk to share the news. "They want to meet with us next month," she said. "You'll come with me, of course." Jaden's eyes widened. "Me? You're the co-founder," she said. "This exists because of you." He didn't know what to say. A part of him still braced for disbelief, for dismissal. But the moment passed, and the offer stood. That night, he told his father about it while they watched the ISS pass overhead from the backyard. His dad wrapped an arm around his shoulder, both of them bundled in jackets, breath misting in the air. "Look at you," his father said. "Doing the work, changing the story." Jaden didn't answer right away. He looked up at the stars, their cold clarity, their endless presence. For so long, they had been symbols of escape, of dreams so distant they could barely be spoken aloud. Now they felt closer. Not because the distance had changed, but because he had. The cold had begun to soften. March was folding quietly into April, and in the long evenings that followed the school day, the sky no longer wore its winter gray quite so heavily. The sun lingered a few minutes longer each day, stretching light across rooftops and front lawns with slow, golden fingers. It was the kind of change that arrived gradually, without ceremony, but brought with it a subtle shift in the air, a loosening of something tight and heavy in the chest. Jaden felt it each time he walked home, each time he stepped outside and saw just a little more of the world before the night returned. At school, the Space Club had grown into something real. What began as a handful of curious students had become a fixture. They had a name now, Nova Crew, and a spot on the school website, complete with a slideshow of photos from their recent projects. The grant application had been approved, and with it came a modest but meaningful budget. Jaden and Mrs. Blake used part of the funds to order a tabletop telescope and a set of astronomy kits, which arrived in a box big enough to make even the principal take notice. The rest would go toward building a resource shelf filled with books and laminated star maps. Plans were underway for a school-wide stargazing night, pending weather and district permission. Mrs. Blake had changed too, though she would never say it outright. She moved through the classroom with a quieter presence now, not distant, not detached, but more deliberate. She no longer interrupted Jaden mid-sentence or overlooked his raised hand. When he spoke, she listened. When he asked to help prepare materials for an upcoming science lesson, she gave him access to the cabinet. And when he corrected a textbook diagram during a group activity, pointing out that the moon's orbit wasn't a perfect circle but slightly elliptical, she didn't just accept the correction. She thanked him. It hadn't erased the past, but it had rewritten what came after. At home, the changes were just as clear. His parents, always supportive. "You've been quiet," he said. Jaden glanced up. "Thinking about the project, about everything." His father studied the drawing for a moment, then sat beside him on the floor, legs crossed, back against the couch. "Tell me." Jaden hesitated. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if I hadn't said anything, if I just let it go when she said I was lying?" His father didn't answer right away. He rested his hand on his knee, fingers tapping a steady rhythm like a countdown waiting for ignition. "I do," he said. "Sometimes. And I think about how small it would have made you feel, for a while, but I also think about how much louder that silence would have gotten, day after day, if you hadn't broken it." Jaden looked down at the sketch. It almost felt easier to say nothing. His father smiled gently. "It always does, until the moment it doesn't." They sat there for a while, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Eventually, Jaden spoke again. She asked me to help her plan next month's unit on planetary systems. His father raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Blake? Jaden nodded. His father let out a soft breath. Look at you, consulting. Jaden laughed. You going to help? Yeah, he said. I want to make sure she gets Europa right. The next few weeks passed in a gentle rhythm. School days moved faster now, filled with projects and planning. Jaden worked with Mrs. Blake to prepare the new unit, assembling diagrams and designing a short quiz on orbital mechanics. He also helped the club prepare for their upcoming stargazing event, which had grown into something far bigger than anyone expected. The principal approved the use of the backfield. Parents were invited. The local astronomy club agreed to bring 2 larger telescopes for public viewing. Flyers went out, colorful and enthusiastic, bearing the Nova Crew logo in bold silver letters. On the night of the event, the field behind Willow Creek Elementary buzzed with activity. Blankets were spread across the grass. Children ran with flashlights, their beams dancing like comets. A table held hot chocolate in paper cups, and parents milled around with hands wrapped in coats and scarves, heads tilted back toward the sky. Jaden stood beside one of the telescopes, adjusting the focus. It wasn't his first time looking through one, not by far, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a kid staring at stars. He was part of something bigger. He was showing others how to see. He stepped back and motioned for a girl from the 2nd grade to look. See that bright one? He said. That's Jupiter. You can even see some of its moons. The girl gasped, then called for her brother to come see. Mrs. Blake stood nearby, talking to a parent. She glanced at Jaden and offered a nod, not a teacher's nod, but something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, or respect. Later, as the crowd began to thin and the stars deepened in the sky, Jaden found his parents sitting together on a blanket. He joined them, wrapping himself in the extra fleece his mother always packed just in case. The 3 of them sat together in silence, their eyes turned upward. The sky was clear that night, exceptionally so. The Milky Way stretched faintly across the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, Jaden felt the full weight and wonder of it settle over him. He thought about how far away it all was, how endless, and yet how close it felt now. His father pointed to a faint streak overhead. Satellite, he said, probably one of ours. Jaden tracked it with his eyes. I want to be up there, he said softly. You will, his father replied, even if it takes years. His father looked at him, especially if it takes years. Jaden turned back to the sky. In his mind, he wasn't just imagining anymore. He was charting, building, preparing. Every sketch, every calculation, every moment spent explaining or listening or standing up for what mattered. It was all part of the journey. He didn't know exactly where it would end, but he knew it had already begun. When they returned home that night, he opened his notebook before brushing his teeth, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote in bold letters, Mission Log Jaden 1. Then, just below it, in smaller writing, he added, Launch Date, TBD, Status, Pre-Flight, Objective, Explore, Witness, Prove. Outside, the stars continued their silent orbit, not waiting for him, just being there. And that, he knew now, was enough. For now. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore the others on the channel. And if this resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.